Okay, our second lesson is going to be entitled, What Happened in AD 70? And this second lesson is going to deal with the history behind it. We hinted at a little of it, but I put that up there so that we can kind of see how this history flows, and I'll talk a little bit about that here in this book. Let's turn over to page 16 in our What Happened in 70 AD book, page 16. Actually, page 15, the bottom of page 15. Josephus and First Century History. How many of you have ever heard of Josephus? Wow, that's amazing. When I was growing up in the Southern Baptist Church in Sunray, Texas, when I got to college, in the dorm room of one of my guys down the hall from me in the dormitory there, I noticed he was a theological student. He was getting ready to go to Dallas Theological Seminary. And so he had a pretty good theological library already started right there in his dorm room up in his bookshelves. And one of the books on his bookshelf was titled Josephus. And I looked at that book and I said, what in the world is that? I'd never heard of Josephus in my life. Never knew he existed. I knew the temple had been destroyed. I didn't know when it was destroyed and how or anything about it, but I knew it wasn't there. But I never heard of Josephus. So you got a leg up on me. When I was 18 years old, I didn't know who he was. But when I heard about his name, and I said, well, who is Josephus? And he said, well, he's a Jewish priest who was selected as one of the 10 generals to lead the Jewish forces against the Romans when they destroyed Judea. And he wrote an eyewitness history of that destruction of Jerusalem. And I said, wow, I never heard of that. I got to get me one of them things. And so I went down to the store and bought one and read it cover to cover. Highlighted it, underlined it, wrote notes in the margin. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit here in this section. One of the things that really captivated me when I read Josephus, because I had just finished reading through the Bible twice in 6 months. But I just finished reading through it, and as I closed the book of Revelation, I said to God, there's something about this book of Revelation I just don't get. I can't understand that. What's the deal here? What's these donkeys and elephants all about? What's this beast and this harlot and this dragon talking about? And I realized I'm going to have to go back to the first century. And so I started collecting commentaries on the book of Revelation. Went down to the bookstore and bought every commentary I could find on the book of Revelation. And about 2 weeks into that process, I stumbled onto a commentary called The Book of Revelation by Foy Wallace. He's a Church of Christ preacher down in Houston, Texas. And he wrote a commentary. And as I was reading through it, I had already collected about 20 commentaries by that time. And I said, I don't really need another commentary on the book of Revelation. So I plopped down on the floor in that Christian bookstore and started thumbing through it just to see if there was anything in there that was different or new or better than what I already had. And I got about 10 pages into that book, and I noticed he was spending about the first 50 pages of that book dealing with the date. None of the other commentaries spent more than a page or two on the date when that book was written. This guy was spending 50 pages proving that the book was written before 70 AD. So I sat down on the floor and I started reading. And it really made sense. For the first time in my life, I began to understand what the book of Revelation was talking about, because he said it was written right back in here just before Jerusalem was destroyed. And it's talking about all the tribulations that the Jews would go through in the process of their temple being destroyed. Amazing, the light bulbs. I mean, I couldn't wait to get that book home and read it. The first time I finally understood it. And what was interesting is, after I was reading through that, then I found out about Josephus. And I started reading Josephus, and there's a section in there where Josephus describes those stone throwers that the Romans used to throw huge stones over against the wall and batter the wall to pieces. And he says, oh, by the way, the weight of those stones that are launched up into the air and come down like hailstones, the weight of those stones is about a talent each. And I just finished reading the book of Revelation where it said there was a great hailstorm against this Babylon, the harlot city. And the weight of those hailstones was about a talent each. And boy, when I read that in Josephus, I said, wait a minute, we're connecting some dots here. That makes sense. Tell me more. And that's why I read through the whole thing, because I wanted to see what else it had to say about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. But so that's where I'm coming from in the book here on page 15. Josephus in first century history. There's some fascinating background information regarding the New Testament and the destruction of Jerusalem in the historical records of Josephus. Now, he's not inspired, and so we have to treat him like we would treat any other historian. But he's fairly accurate in most of his stuff. Now, fortunately, we know what his biases are, and so when we read some of his accounts of certain events, we know that he's coming from a Jewish background, so he's going to slant that toward his Jewish bias. But he was also good friends of his patrons Vespasian and Titus, and so he's going to spin things in their direction as well to keep them happy, because they're paying for his lavish lifestyle in Rome at the time he was writing that. So we know what his biases are, and we can take those into account as we read his history. But he did a very fair job of recording the history, and he was an eyewitness to it, so that what we're reading is eyewitness account. He was a Jewish priest. He served in the temple and became one of the top 10 generals of the Jewish war against Rome. He was captured early in the war by Vespasian, and he predicted that Vespasian would become emperor. Vespasian just about lopped his head off. But he says, man, that's an interesting prophecy. I'll keep you alive long enough to see if that comes true. And if it doesn't come true, you're a dead duck, because it looks like you're just trying to win my favor and get out of being killed. So he kept him alive, and sure enough, just a couple years later, he became emperor. The reason this information is so valuable is because he was a Jewish eyewitness writing for both the Jewish and Roman readers, and therefore forced to be accurate and objective as possible. Now, what's interesting is that Josephus says that just before the war began in 66 AD, he says that they saw angelic armies in the sky above Judea, above Israel, in their armor, in their chariots, flitting about in the sky above Israel. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew 24 and Luke 21? He says, there will be signs in the heavens. And these are those signs, like Matthew 24, verse 29 through 31. You might want to look at some of these and compare it to Luke's account. Luke is a little bit more graphic. But in Matthew 24, verse 29, immediately after the persecution, after the tribulation, the Neronic persecution, and by the way, that happened in 64. So this was the persecution of Nero from 64 to 66, those last 2 years just before the war broke out. And it was the breakout of the war which stopped the persecution against the church, because both the Jews and the Romans then had to turn their attention to fighting a war against each other. So they quit rounding up the Christians and started fighting a war. So that cut short that tribulation upon the church right there in 66 AD. And just before the war broke out, they saw the angelic armies in the sky. Now notice what Jesus says about that in Matthew 24. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, that's when it was cut short. Notice he says up here in verse 22, unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. None of the elect, none of the Christians would have lived and remained until the second coming if that persecution had not been cut short. And it was cut short right here. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. That sign of the Son of Man was Christ with his angelic armies in the sky above Israel. And you'll see that more clearly in Luke chapter 21, where he uses a parallel account of that in different words. Luke 21, verse 25. There will be signs in the sun and moon and stars, and on the earth dismay among nations, in perplexity at the roaring of the waves, of the sea of the waves, men fainting from fear and the expectation of the things which are coming upon the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. So there it is. There's your angelic armies coming with Christ to pour out his wrath upon that Jewish nation because of their persecution of his saints and because of their crucifixion of him. That's why Josephus is so critical and so helpful, because he was an eyewitness. He saw all this stuff occur, and he gives us the testimony we need to show that Jesus literally meant what he said when he said it's going to come before some of those standing here taste of death. Josephus says that just before the war, angelic armies, chariots, and troops of soldiers running about among the clouds were seen surrounding Jewish cities. He records the fact that people in the first century called Jerusalem the great city. Surprise, surprise. Where have you heard that phrase before? Book of Revelation, right? It refers to this great city called Babylon, the harlot city, going to be destroyed. That's what the book of Revelation is all about. And Josephus refers to Jerusalem as being the great city. That's another one of those connect the dots deals. When I read Josephus after reading the book of Revelation, it really made sense. It really resonated. He says that the AD 70 conflict with Rome was the revolution of the ages. That's the changing of one age to another. Matthew 24, verse 3 says, "When will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" In Matthew 12, verse 32, Jesus talks about not only in this age, but in the age about to come. It's one of those mellow texts. Not only in this age, but in the age to come. And it's the age that was about to come. It wasn't 2,000 years away. So this is the kind of stuff that Josephus is making. These kind of statements that tie in right with Matthew 24. He talks about pools of blood and intense fires, similar to the descriptions we find in the book of Revelation, such as Revelation 14, verse 20, and other passages. Didn't Jesus predict that these kinds of things would happen? Yeah, we just read that in Luke 21, 25 through 27. Josephus' history furnishes numerous other insights into the nature of the war and its significance for both Jews and Christians. But not only Josephus records these things. The Roman historian Tacitus and the Christian historian Eusebius both say that these things happened. And so we've got not just the word of one eyewitness, we've got multiple historians. Tacitus is a first century historian. He wasn't an eyewitness to Jerusalem being destroyed, but he knew about it happening. And he was well acquainted with Vespasian and Titus. The Talmud also, the Jewish writings by the rabbis called the Talmud, records these similar things as well. For instance, Yoma is one of the tractates of the Talmud, one of the 12 or 15 volumes of that Talmud. Folio 39b has some historical information about the destruction of Jerusalem. So this is not just something conjured up by preterists in the 21st century. This is something that was already written in the first century about things that they saw happen. So what we're talking about here is that the prophesied end time events did occur. We've got historical testimony to verify that. Now, uninspired testimony can never prove anything. And so we don't use Josephus as proof that these things were fulfilled. But uninspired testimony can support the Scripture and can help us understand the Scripture. And that's why we use Josephus, to help us understand what Scripture is talking about and to help us see that Scripture is right after all. And so it supports Scripture and helps us understand Scripture. The New Testament writers describe these events in apocalyptic language, while Josephus, Tacitus, and the Talmud record the fulfillment of those events in literal language. Now, we talked about the stones that were used by the catapults. In the book of Revelation, that's described as hailstones. It's a hailstorm. In Josephus, it's literal language about the catapults throwing those rocks over into the deal. So you can see the difference between apocalyptic language or symbolic language versus the literal language we see in Josephus. And Josephus really helps us because for people living 2,000 years after the first century, we need some help to know what the donkey and elephant cartoons in the book of Revelation are talking about. Okay, let's look at some of those fulfillments that Josephus mentions in his writings, and I've just given a smattering of them, 25 of them here. I mean, this just barely scratches the surface of stuff that I have available. Some of my series of podcasts and other seminars where I've done a study of Matthew 24, I pulled out hundreds of these quotes from Josephus. So this is just some of the best. This is like a couple dozen of the goodies. Number one, Jews of that generation were more wicked than any other before that time. And it's not just Jesus and the apostles who say that. In Matthew chapter 12, verse 45, Jesus talks about that generation being more wicked than any other generation before it. He refers to it as a perverse and wicked generation. And that's, by the way, quoting Deuteronomy 28 through 32, where God told Moses that in your latter days, when you reject my law and reject my teaching, in your latter years, latter days, last days, the final end, in those days, a perverse generation will arise, which will break my law, break my covenant, kill my people, and I will destroy them. And so Jesus is referring to his contemporary generation. He's saying, remember what Moses said way back there in Deuteronomy 32, that there would arise a perverse and crooked generation which would break his law and persecute his people. You are that generation. You are the perverse generation that was prophesied. And Josephus uses that very language in Wars, Book 5, Chapter 10, Section 5. he uses that very language about his own people. I mean, this is the Jewish priest talking about his own people, how wicked they were. And he describes that wickedness in very vivid language. I don't know if you've ever read Josephus, but his descriptions of the cannibalism and all the stuff that went on in the city is just abominable, literally abominable. And that helps us understand what Jesus meant when he said, when you see all those things, when you see that abomination that causes desolation, then you'll know it's near. And number 2 here, Jesus predicted days of vengeance, distress, and wrath to come upon the Jewish people. And Josephus mentions every one of those things in graphic detail, page after page after page, literally showing what happened in fulfillment of what Jesus said. Number 3, wars and rumors of wars. Josephus records that all during this period, especially right here in 40, I think it's 39 AD. Caligula wanted to set up his image in the temple at Jerusalem, and he commanded a couple of legions of the armies to march to Jerusalem and put up his image in the temple, and the Jews were ready to die for it right there. I mean, they were ready to go to war at that point. And so there was a lot of rumors and wars floating around, and all the other nations around there were saying, oh boy, the Romans are going to send their crack troops down to Judea. This is our time to revolt as well. And so there was lots of other nations that were rumoring a revolt from Rome at that same time. So this is literally fulfilled. Jesus is not talking about 2,000 years off in the future. He's talking about what was going to happen right then in that generation, just before Jerusalem was destroyed. And Josephus records every bit of that. Number 5 here on page 17, Jerusalem was called Sodom and that great city. In the book of Revelation, we see that. And I want you to go to Revelation chapter 11. You just got to see this. And I got a pretty good collection of commentaries on the book of Revelation. And it's amazing how many of them skip right over chapter 11, verse 3 or 4 here. Let's see. Yeah, it's verse 8. It's amazing the dance that they do around verse 8. You'll see what I mean. Let's read chapter 11, verses 1 through 8 real quickly. Then there was given me a measuring rod like a staff, and someone said, "Get up and measure the temple of God, and the altar, and those who worship in it." Now, what temple are they talking about? The one in Jerusalem. That was, by the way, still standing when this was written. Now, if the book was written after 70 AD, this wouldn't make much sense, would it? Imagine Colombo being around back in that day, and the book was written after 70 AD, and Colombo says, just one thing I don't understand here. What temple did he measure? So what does that imply? I mean, this book was written before the temple was destroyed. He tells this angel to measure it. Leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the nations, and they will tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months. Now that tells you what city and temple it's talking about, right? Verse 2, the holy city. There's only one city that goes with that description. That's Jerusalem. Verse 3, and I will grant authority to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. These are the 2 olive trees, the 2 lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. And if anyone wants to harm them, fire flows out of their mouth and devours their enemies, so that if anyone wants to harm them, he must be killed in this same way. These have the power to shut up the sky, like Elijah did, so that rain will not fall during the days of their prophesying. And they have power over the waters to turn them into blood, like Moses did. So these two prophets who appear at the end are coming in the spirit and power of Moses and Elijah, the way they're described here. And they'll strike the earth with every plague as often as they desire to sow them. When they have finished their testimony, the beast that comes up out of the abyss will make war with them and overcome them and kill them. And the corpse of them will lie in the street of the great city. Sound familiar? The great city? Josephus calls Jerusalem the great city, which is mystically called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. Now, how many cities in the world would fit that description? We know Jerusalem was called Sodom and Egypt because Josephus says so. And we know it was in the holy city. It was a holy city, and that's Jerusalem also, verse 2. And there's only one city in the world that's got the claim to be the place where Jesus was crucified. No other city would fit that. So who does that make the great city, the harlot city, the wicked city Babylon out to be? 70 AD, it's Jerusalem. And if this is talking about the downfall of Jerusalem, then it had to be written before 70 AD. You see that? Verse 8 just absolutely nails it. If you had any doubt after verses 1 and 2, verse 8 proves that the book of Revelation was written about the destruction of Jerusalem. No way around that. I mean, you just flat out have to deny it. And you'd have to read the commentaries to see how they dance around verse 8. I mean, they just try to ignore it. They try to sweep it under the rug and play like it doesn't say that, or it means something else. I know that's what it says, but it just cannot mean that. Just cannot mean that. Because they don't want it to mean that. Because it doesn't fit their paradigm. But that's what it says. Okay. And that's where Josephus really comes in handy, because he shows that Jerusalem was the city that was called Sodom, it was called Egypt, it was called Babylon, it was called all these other names, harlot cities. It fits the description. And the first century people would have known that. They would have understood that language. That was like a donkey and elephant to them. They knew exactly what that was talking about. Jerusalem was called Sodom and that great city. Jerusalem had a large maritime commerce, and it was capital over the 10 districts of Palestine. You'll see this referred to in Revelation chapter 17 and 18, where it talks about this great city having a huge trade that comes from the sea. And Jerusalem was that place. It was like in the center of the Near East, and where all the trade routes came right through Jerusalem. And so they had a huge trade, not only from the Mediterranean Ocean, but from all the eastern trades routes that came through there. And that's described for us very well in Revelation 17 and 18. And Josephus talks about it. In verse number 8 here on page 17, he says, angelic armies were seen in the sky above the Jewish cities. What's interesting about this is that in Matthew 24, they wanted to know the day and the hour. You know, disciples ask him, when's this going to occur? Can you give us a little hint? Well, he did give Peter a little bit of a hint. He says, when you get old, you're going to stretch out your arms, and they're going to take you where you do not wish to go. So Peter knew that it was not going to come immediately. He knew the second coming was not going to be immediately. He knew he would have to get to old age before that would arrive. Angelic armies were seen in the sky. And what's very interesting is Josephus gives us the day and the hour of that sighting of the angelic armies. And he says he's quoting numerous eyewitnesses who saw it. Now, I'm not sure if he was back in Israel at the time that happened. I'm not sure if he was. But he's quoting other fellow priests who had seen it. He had gone to Rome for 4 years, from 62 AD to 66, and he got back to Israel just before the war broke out, or just after it broke out. So I'm not sure if he saw this or not, but he's quoting eyewitnesses who did see it. And he gives us the very day and hour that it occurred. Now, that's very interesting, isn't it? Jesus said you're not going to know the day or the hour. Nobody can know it until it actually happens. And then it happens, and Josephus gives us the very day and hour when it happened. And that was a sign of the coming of the Son of Man. Matthew 24, verse 30. They saw the angelic armies. 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verses 7 and 8 refer to him coming in flaming fire, pouring out wrath upon his enemies. Uses that same kind of language about angelic armies coming with him. Number 9 now on page 17. Daily sacrifices ceased in the middle of the week. And there's a big debate about this, and I'm not so sure that I can settle that debate at all, but there is a debate about what daily sacrifices they're referring to here. But there were some daily sacrifices for Nero and for Rome that were performed every day, and they were at the expense of Nero himself. Nero paid for those sacrifices every day in the temple for him and for Rome. And those, as well as all sacrifices for all Gentiles, were stopped right here in 66 AD by Eleazar, one of the 3 faction leaders of the Zealots. He took control of the temple. He was the Sagan. He was the captain of the temple guard. He took control of the temple and refused any sacrifices from any Gentiles, including Nero. And that was a declaration of war. When he did that, that declared war against Rome and sent shockwaves through the rest of the Roman Empire. But that happened in, I believe it was the summer, probably June or July, something like that, all of 66 AD, when those sacrifices were stopped. Daily sacrifices were ceased in the midst of the week after 3.5 years. Okay, number 10 now. 3 armed factions fought against each other inside Jerusalem. Those 3 faction leaders were Eleazar ben Ananias and John of Giscala and Simon son of Giora were the 3 guys that they warred against each other. And that was one of the reasons why Titus, the Roman general, held off and didn't surround the city and raise the siege against it for quite a while. They held off on that. And Vespasian, his father, also held off, backed away from Jerusalem, because there was 3 factions in the city fighting against each other, killing off all their soldiers and destroying each other's food supplies. Vespasian says, they're doing more damage than I would be able to do. Let them fight it out, weaken themselves so I can swoop in and finish it off. And that's what he did, and that's what made them so weak that they were easy pickings for the Romans. Three armed factions. And Revelation 16 verse 19 talks about that. In the streets of the great city there was three factions. And it talks about it. Revelation 16:19. And then the book of Josephus, Wars, book 5, chapter 1, verses or sections 1 through 5, talks about those three factions as well. And you can just see the dots are connected very easily between Revelation and Josephus. Okay, look at number 15 here on page 17. The Zealot rebellion was like a wild beast, eating its own flesh. That's the way Josephus describes it. And that's the same way it is in Revelation pretty well. If you look at Revelation 16:10 and Revelation 17:16 and Revelation 19 through 21, you can see the beast fighting against itself. And then we talked about number 17 before, the hailstones weighing a talent each. That was really amazing to me when I read that in Josephus for the first time, after having just read the book of Revelation. Wow, that really caught my attention. What else is not very well understood is Josephus talks about the temple being set fire, and it was not the Romans that set fire to it first. Some of the other buildings around the temple had been set fire by the Jews themselves. And so that Jews set fire to their temple first. And Revelation 17:16 talks about the harlot being burned with fire. Just like that. Okay, let's see. Now, on page 18, let's look at number 22. If you want the references to Josephus, they're right here, where he gives the day and the hour that the angelic armies were seen. Those references right there. It's Wars, book 6, chapter 5, section 3. Same way with this number 22. Not one stone of the temple was left standing upon another. That was fulfilled literally. What happened was when the temple was burned, all the gold and silver that was in the temple melted and melted down into the cracks between the stones of the temple. And so the Romans went in there and tore it apart stone by stone to get all that gold and silver out of there. And they literally fulfilled Jesus' words. Not one stone here shall be left upon another, which will not be torn down. And that occurred right here in 70 A.D. Right after they finished destroying the city, they dismantled the walls, dismantled the temple stone by stone, took all the gold. Number 23, the tribulation was the worst ever. And this is not just Jesus who says that. Notice Jeremiah 30 verse 7 says the same kind of stuff. Daniel 12 verse 1 talks about that wicked generation and the tribulation that against the saints at the time of the end. And then Revelation 16 also, verse 18, refers to that generation of people as, or that tribulation, that persecution being the worst ever. And it's referring to the Neronic persecution, which began in 62. It was cut short in 66, but that 2 years was the most traumatic persecution history has ever recorded. Tacitus refers to it a little bit, and some of the other Roman historians talk about it. Awful. I mean, they didn't just hang Christians on a cross. They smeared tar all over them and then lit it with a flame. And they sewed up Christians in leather bags and put them in the arena for the wild dogs to tear apart. Fed them to the lions. Stuff that no other time in history has Christians been treated like that. No other time did Christians or God's people suffer that kind of a traumatic persecution. It's the worst ever in the histories of mankind. And Josephus says that. He says he had never witnessed, never knew of any time that was more traumatic for Christians than that, or for God's people than that. It was the worst tribulation ever. The AD 70 destruction was the turning point of the ages, or revolution of the ages. And God, not the Romans, took the kingdom away from the Jews. You know all of Jesus' parables where he talks about the vineyard owners. A vineyard owner rented out his vineyard to some vineyard growers, vine growers, and then he sent his slaves back to those vineyard growers to receive his profits off of their harvest. And what did they do to those slaves? They mistreated them, beat them up, threw them out of the vineyard, killed them. So the vineyard owner says, well, I'll send my son. Maybe they will respect my son. And they killed his son. And then Jesus asked, what do you think that vineyard owner is going to do when he comes? And the Jews said, he's probably going to kill him. And Jesus says, exactly. The kingdom will be taken away from you and given to a new nation producing the fruit of it. When did that occur? Had to be 70 AD. That's when their kingdom was literally destroyed and taken away from them. Okay, I think our time is probably up, but you've got the book, so you can read the rest at your leisure. If you got any questions, be sure and write those down and put them right up here. And after the break, we'll come back and deal with your questions. Thank you so much.